Hi, sixth grade. I am back, and today we're going to be reviewing what you guys should have already read, and that is information on the Mayas. So we are going to be starting at page 296, and I do want you to get your books, and I do want you to follow along. If you hear any strange noises, my children are awake, and so you might hear wrestling or strange howling sounds. But that is because my people are awake, and hopefully it doesn't sound like they're gonna crash to the ceiling, but you may hear like fighting and arguing. Just ignore that. Okay, so I hope you guys are doing good. I want to keep reviewing, and if we can finish up our review in the next couple of days, then we will take our test via Kahoot by the end of the week, and we will be able to move on from there. So the Mayas, so interesting, and I've been to the Mayan ruins. It's a really cool place to visit. So let's just jump in, page 296. Another great civilization in Mesoamerica was the Mayan civilization. Archaeologists have found early traces of Mayan-speaking villages dating as far back as the time of the Olmecs. These villages contained groups of houses surrounded by fields. Some villages had public buildings, possibly for religious or governmental uses. For about 2,500 years, the Mayas built farms and homes in the rainforests and high plateaus. The Mayas also settled in the lowlands. There, they could get fresh water from deep sinkholes called cenotes. As the Mayas prospered, their population increased and their villages grew larger. By AD 250, Mayas dominated the region and built city-states. One of the largest and most magnificent city-states was Tikal. Archaeologists believe this city-state's population was at least 60,000. Tikal's buildings and people covered more than 47 square miles. Between 250 and 900, the Mayas made advances in art, architecture, and literature. The Mayas wrote hundreds of books. They made thousands of sculptures and constructed huge palaces and pyramid-shaped temples. The Mayas built irrigation systems for their fields. They studied the stars, composed music and songs, and played games. They traded regularly within the network of their own cities and with other people. In the mid-1500s, a Spanish priest named Diego de Landa tried to make the Mayas accept Roman Catholicism. When the Mayas refused to accept the new religion, de Landa had some of them stretched on pulleys, burned with candles, or tortured in other ways. De Landa had an entire library of Mayan books burned in 1562, since they contained nothing but superstitions and falsehoods of the devil. So I don't necessarily disagree with him. The Mayan civilization definitely did not serve the one true living God, and a lot of their religious practices and things like that were not biblical. They were not godly. And so when he, quote, says, since they contained nothing but superstitions and falsehoods of the devil, burned their books, he's not wrong in the fact that their beliefs were ungodly and even evil. However, if you're trying to convert someone to your religion, do you think that stretching them on pulleys or burning them with candles or torturing them in other ways is going to convert them to your religion? No. But when they did not want to convert, he thought that he would convince them by doing these things. And no, it didn't. It didn't work. But he did this once they refused. If someone proposed their religion to you and you declined, and then they tortured you, would that in any way make you want to be a part of their religion? Of course not. So they absolutely didn't after the way that he treated them. And so even though he claimed to have a better religion or claim to be a Roman Catholic, he did not go about things the right way, and he did not treat them appropriately at all. And so a lot of the books that he burned, and so it's difficult for us to even find some of those things to learn more about the Mayans, because many of their books, especially their religious books, were burned. Afterward, De Landa realized that converting the Mayans would be easier if he knew more about them. He became a careful student of the Mayas and tried to translate their symbolic writing into Spanish. Much of the information known today about the Mayas of the 1500s and their ancient ancestors comes from De Landa's writings. The rest of the information has been carefully gathered from the stones and artifacts in Mayan lands. Today, some Mayan descendants still play the music of their ancestors. They're very proud. If they're of Mayan descent, they're very proud to be of Mayan descent. And they have a very specific look about them. You may think that all Mexican people may look Mexican. But there is a distinct difference between Mayans and other people who live in that vicinity in the Yucatan Peninsula and in other places in Mexico, or even other Hispanic people. The Mayans do have a very distinct look about them, and they're very proud of that. Some of the ball courts, irrigation systems, and roads the traders used can still be seen, but many of the buildings and statues lie in ruins. Almost all the Mayan books are gone, and with them much information about how the Mayas lived and thought. So the Mayan ruins, which I think we'll talk about as we keep going, but the Mayan ruins are still there, so you do see some of their buildings and their pyramids and like the altars that they used to make sacrifices to their gods. And one of the reasons why their practices were considered evil is because it's believed that they actually would perform human sacrifices, much like some other people that we will study as well in this chapter. But that's why they were thought to be evil, and their practices to be, full of superstitions, and they wanted to please their gods, and sometimes that involved human sacrifices. And so it's a little eerie when you're there at the ruins and things like that. So let's keep going. Math and astronomy. Is there a 0 in your telephone number or your street address? The ancient Mayas were one of the early civilizations that developed the idea of 0. With their 0, the Mayas were able to do difficult calculations and keep detailed records. Their math system was based on the number 20, unlike our decimal system now, which is based on 10. The Mayas also made calendars similar to the calendar developed by the Olmecs. The Mayan calendar was based on the cycles of the moon and the sun. Their solar year had the same number of days that ours does. The calendar was made after years of careful observation of the sky. These observations were so accurate that the Mayas were able to figure out the orbits of the planets and could predict an eclipse of the sun. How cool is that? They were actually very intelligent people. They were an ancient civilization, but very intelligent. Why were they very intelligent? Because they were made in the image of God. And even though they may not have served the one true living God, they were still made in his image. He made them to be smart, intelligent people, okay? And so we see that in the things that they developed that we still use today. We use the 0, right? And if you look here, these are the Mayan numbers, 0 to 24. They certainly look different than our Arabic numerals that we write. However, you can see like the 1, 2, 3, 4 with the dots. That almost looks like our dice, like what you would see on dice that we would play with. So not too far gone. Something that's interesting to remember about the Mayans. So they did develop a calendar that's very similar to ours, and the same, days in the calendar year, and they stopped after 1999. So in the year 2000, or as it was called, Y2K, so when we were about to have New Year's from 1999 into the year 2000, like everybody was like wondering like what was going to happen. Was the world going to end? Were we really going to go into the year 2000? People were wondering if computers would transfer over, if everything would transfer over, because for as long as technology had been developed, it was in the 1900s, right? It was in the 20th century. So when we got to the end of 1999, literally people were like freaking out, thinking that computers were going to crash and that nothing was going to work, because they weren't sure if everything would convert over then to the 21st century, to the year 2000. It was fine. We're all good. We're still here. But everybody was freaking out because the Mayans only went to 1999. So from ancient civilization, their calendars went all the way to 1999, but they didn't go past that. So everybody's like, did the Mayans know something that we don't know? And, just trying to freak everybody out. But they were like, we would call them memes today, but like little cartoons about, the Mayans their calendar only going to 1999. So it was like, is that like a prophetic thing where, the world's just going to stop working, at the end of 1999? It didn't. We were good, and we're still here. Okay, so next page, 298, writing and books. It was not until the 1970s that the Mayan hieroglyphics were understood. Today, 85% of known Mayan texts have been translated. Mayan writing was a combination of words and units of sound. Thus, anything that could be spoken could also be written. Furthermore, the Mayas made books of their writings. They wrote on long strips of paper made of fig tree bark. To make this paper, the Mayas pulled bark off the fig trees and soaked it in water to remove the sap. They then beat the bark with wooden hammers and stretched it out to make a wide, flat surface. The material was then cut into strips. Each strip was coated with a thin layer of a gummy substance for strength. Then the strip was painted over with lime to make its surface white. Scribes wrote and drew on the paper with paint made from vegetables and minerals. When the strips were dry, they were folded in an accordion fashion and bound between wooden covers. The type of book that the Mayas made is called a codex. A Mayan codex was usually about 8 inches high and several yards long when unfolded. Today, only 3 Mayan books are known to exist. One contains observations about the planet Venus and charts used to predict solar eclipses. It does not tell anything about Mayan customs or history, nor does it give any clues to the fate of the Mayan civilization. And no, we are not going to make one, but if you want to make one at home with your mom, you can, but we already made paper. Okay, we already made paper, and we're not making more paper because that took a long time. But hey, make yourself a codex if you want to with your mama, but not this mama because we already made paper. Okay, page 299, the Mayan people. They were very interesting individuals, as you can see from the picture. Historians today can see how the ancient Mayas looked from the sculptures and paintings they left behind. According to Diego de Landa, the Mayan people were about 5 feet tall and had thick, dark hair. The men wore their long hair in braids around the tops of their head, with one braid down the back. Women also wore braids, usually coiled around their heads and held in place with ribbons. Today, the Mayan people are still very small. They're very short and still have thick, dark hair. They don't wear their hair in braids like this, just everyday people out on the street. However, they are still very, very short, like 5 feet tall. It's probably average. The Mayans appear to have preferred long noses and sloping foreheads. Some used clay to create a ridge from the top of the forehead to the bridge of the nose. A true sign of beauty, the sloping head had to be formed early in life. Parents bound newborns' heads between boards until the soft bones grew into a slanted, almost cone shape. So they would shape their children's heads to be sloped here and going down into the bridge of the nose. So the head would be sloped and flat. They thought this was pretty, okay? But you hear about things like this in other civilizations. Like one of the things you hear about in China is that they think that it's pretty to have small feet. So they would bind children's feet so that they wouldn't grow, so they would stay small. And unfortunately, a lot of these children end up with deformed feet, and they have trouble walking, and it changes their bone structure because they had their feet bound because they thought small feet were pretty. I have big feet, so but they would purposefully put boards on their kids' heads. Like, if you've ever seen a newborn, they say laying a newborn on its back is the safest way for a newborn to sleep. So after a while, a lot of newborns get like a flat head. And so once a baby can move his head around, what a mom might do is lay the baby on, the sides of its head, so the back of its head doesn't stay flat. Once a baby can like lift up its own head and move its head around when it's sleeping, it's safe to do that. But for a while, when they're newborn and they can't really lift their own head and move it around, moms lay them on their back, and so the back of their head gets flat. So it's the same kind of thing. They would put boards on their foreheads to get their foreheads to be flat and sloping down into an elongated bridge of the nose. It was just something they thought was attractive, and that's part of their culture. That's what they did. Historical evidence indicates the Mayas also preferred crossed eyes. Are my eyes crossed? One of them? I don't know. They preferred their eyes to be crossed. Now, if you want to practice crossing your eyes, your mom might tell you not to do it for too long because it gets stuck that way. But it's hard. You can't see right. If you're crossing your eye, I don't know if I can do, am I doing both or just one? I can't tell. If you cross your eyes, you can't see clearly. You can't see straight. But this was something else that they thought was attractive. And so they preferred crossed eyes because one of their gods was cross-eyed. To achieve this look, parents hung a bead between the baby's eyes. After the baby looked at the bead for months, his eyes grew permanently crossed. Why would you do that to your baby? It's terrible. When older, the Mayas made other changes to their appearances. Most young men shaved their hair above their foreheads to show off their slanting foreheads and brows. They also tattooed symbols on their arms, legs, and faces. Many had their ears pierced. The men wore earplugs in holes sliced into their lobes, and they kept adding bigger and bigger plugs until the holes were several inches across. In these holes, they placed discs of jade or shell. Today we call them gauges. People that they get their ears pierced and they start putting larger and larger and larger and larger gauges in their ears. I'm sure you've seen this. And then what happens is their earlobes get stretched out, and when they don't have a gauge in their ear, they have this huge stretched out earlobe with a hole in the middle. And it's not very attractive, but the Mayas were, they thought it was attractive, and they were the first civilization to do that, to do the gauges. And it just makes you pause to think, when there's a fad or when there's something that comes around, it's good to stop and not just jump in to do something that someone else is doing, even if it is something that's cool, which I don't think gauges are cool, but even if it is something they're like, oh, I'm interested in it, stop and like do a little bit of research. Find out where that came from, because if it originated here in the Mayan civilization, the Mayan people were not followers of God. They were followers of false gods and false religions, and they even had some evil practices and human sacrifice, and even, child sacrifice to appease their gods. And, some of the things that they would do often went back to appeasing their god, or, in some cases they thought it looked nice. But, do we want to emulate a people in a civilization who didn't serve God and who did things to please or appease other gods? Or, it's important to stop and say, where does this come from? Who was the first to do this, and why? Is this something that is going to, number one, be beneficial to my body? Am I honoring the temple that God has given me? And number two, is this something that's honoring to God? Is this something that, I think it's important whenever we make choices that are permanent, like a gauge, because I would imagine unless you get some kind of surgical procedure to fix your ear, that's always going to be like that. And you may, when you get older and you want to have a respectable job and you want to go for a job interview where you could do really well and have a nice position and make a lot of money, are they going to hire someone whose earlobe hangs down to their shoulder because they used to wear gauges? And these are things that you have to think about. Like, is this a decision that long term is going to be beneficial to me? The Mayas weren't really faced with the possibility of, job opportunities, job interviews that they had to go to. It was just something that culturally they did. Both men and women would often file their teeth to points and inlay them with jade. These people must have looked really scary. So if they file their teeth to points, and in between the points, they would fill it with jade. Jade is a green gem. And so they would fill the gaps of their pointed teeth with jade. So they got this going on, they got this going on, they got this going on, they were probably a little scary to see. I wouldn't want to come up on one in the dark. Mayas took frequent baths, and Mayas took frequent baths, a practice shunned and feared in Europe at the time. Europeans didn't take frequent baths. They were afraid of baths. They didn't like them. They liked perfume, which they made from flowers and herbs. Most of the men carried mirrors to check their appearance from time to time. So the Mayas were very careful about their appearance, even though it's not something that we necessarily think was a good look. They were very concerned about it. The guys would carry mirrors to check their appearance from time to time. They were all worried about how they looked. They liked perfume. They wanted to smell good. They wanted to bathe, and they wanted to be clean, which is a good thing. So thumbs up for the bathing and the wanting to be clean and smelling good. We'll give that to the Mayas. They had that going for them. We are not going to sculpt a Maya, but hey, if you want to do this little project at home, you are more than welcome to, if you got any clay laying around. But you can kind of see from the little sculpture there, a clay figure of a Mayan official. See that kind of sloped forehead? That was the look they were going for. Let's jump over to page 301, talking about social classes. Classes of Mayan society had several levels. At the top was the ruler, the absolute king. Like the Egyptians, the Mayas believed that their kings were descended from gods and that they should be obeyed without question. The kings, in return, claimed to speak to the gods on behalf of the people. Really? That's what they claim. Most kings took advantage of this absolute authority and cruelly mistreated the people. Each city-state had a unique hieroglyphic and represented it, Let me start over. Each city-state had a unique hieroglyphic to represent it and its king. Through these hieroglyphics, I'm sorry, my kids are jumping on the bed above me, and so like I'm so distracted because like, do you hear them jumping? Did you hear that? Yeah, that would be Jacoby. Through these hieroglyphics, scholars have been able to identify 33 rulers of the city-state Tikal. At least one ruler was a queen. The notable king of Tikal was Jasal Chan Kawil the First. Tikal had been weak and struggling when Jasal came to power. Under his leadership, it became strong once again. Many steles and other carvings tell of this king. Just below the kings in power were the priests. There were at least 4 classes of priests. The highest ranking priests were in charge of all the others. They taught writing, astronomy, mathematics, and religious rituals. Lower ranks included priests who treated sickness. Sometimes their cure was more dangerous than the illness. Imagine going to the doctor with a nosebleed only to have your foot cut off. That's what it was like. This was done to the sufferer to let them bleed freely. Other priests were fortune tellers. The priests also offered sacrifices to the gods. In the same social class as the priests were the nobles. All the priests came from nobility. The nobles, both men and women, were educated and they held important positions in the government. Lesser nobles included the artists and architects, traders and scribes, and advisors and engineers. Although they did not have the high positions of the first class of nobles, they had many of the same privileges. No nobleman or noblewoman had to do manual work, such as planting crops, grinding corn, or cleaning. Such labor was left to the common people. Here's Jasal here. See, notice the sloped forehead that goes down into the bridge of the nose. See that look? That's so interesting that they thought that was attractive. All right, next page. 302. The peasants did the hard manual work of the Mayan society. They grew, harvested, and processed the food. The peasants grew cotton and produced fabrics. They tended the buildings. Some were soldiers in the armies and laborers for the construction of monuments and temples. At the bottom of Mayan society were the slaves. Anyone who was in debt or who had committed a crime was considered a slave, the property of another. Sometimes prisoners of war were kept as well as slaves as well. Important prisoners were used for sacrifices. Lesser ones were made to work. Most Mayas wore simple cotton clothes. The men wore tunics and loincloths, like the priest over here. Sometimes, did you hear that? Kobe just jumped off the bed. He's probably going to come down here and tell on Jonas. Let's see. Most Mayans wore simple cotton clothes. The men wore tunics and loincloths, sometimes with a short cape. The women wore straight, plain dresses or wraparound skirts and long blouses. The Mayas either went barefoot or wore sandals made of straw and rope. Sounds comfy. Most men and women wore a lot of jewelry, earrings, rings, armbands, and necklaces. They made jewelry from jade, shells, volcanic rock, or animal teeth and bones. Wealthy people wore the same things as the common people, only with more embellishments, such as feathers woven into fabric. They wore shoes made of deer skin. The kings wore jaguar skins and jade breastplates. The 3-foot plumes in their headdresses and on their clothes came from the quetzal, a beautiful bird of the rainforest. Kings also wore jade bands on their wrists and ankles, as well as gold rings on their toes. To the common Maya, a king's appearance must have been dazzling indeed. I got a low battery warning, but we almost done. Okay, let's look at page 303, the desire for chocolate. Do you like hot chocolate? Many people do. It is a tasty echo from the tables of Mayan kings and nobles. The Mayas invented the drink that, with some variation, has been popular for centuries. The Mayas made their hot drink from powdered cocoa beans. Chocolate was so special to the Mayans that the cocoa beans or cacao, were also used for money. In the Mayan society, a slave was worth 100 cacao beans or cocoa beans. Because the beans were so valuable, counterfeiters sometimes filled empty bean pods with dirt or sand and passed them off as real beans. If caught, the counterfeiter was made a slave. Poor people could rarely afford the luxury of grinding up their money to make a hot drink. Think about that. Interesting. Very interesting. Okay. Let's see. We have done this for 30 minutes, so I'm going to stop this video and I will make a second Mayan video so that this one isn't too long. So we'll stop here and I will charge my phone and then I'll do Mayan video number 2.